Andrew Tate's story does not begin in the ring. It begins in the quiet, intense silence of a chessboard. His father, Andrew Tate, was not a wealthy man, but he was a man of genius. A world-class chess master, feared and respected in tournaments across America. Emery believed that chess was not just a game, it was training for survival. And his sons, Andrew and Tristan, absorbed these lessons not through lectures, but through watching him dominate opponents with nothing but patience, calculation, and nerve. In the Tate household, life was not about comfort. It was about sharpening the mind. There were no safe spaces, no gentle encouragement. Instead, Emery taught his boys that the world is ruthless, that weakness will be punished, and that strategy will always defeat raw emotion. Life, he would say, is chess. If you play carelessly, you lose. As a boy, Andrew admired his father's brilliance, but also felt the weight of expectation. He was not the biggest, not the strongest, but he was competitive. He hated losing even in casual games. And slowly, he internalized one truth. If you don't want to lose, you must be willing to suffer more than anyone else to win. School never inspired him. He wasn't interested in following the traditional path. What fired him up was competition. Whether it was chess, sports, or debates, he wanted to test himself. He wanted to know where the limits really were. It was during his teenage years that Andrew stumbled upon the thing that would change his life. Combat sports. Unlike chess, this wasn't a game of abstract strategy. This was real. This was blood, sweat, broken bones, and humiliation if you failed. The first time he stepped into a kickboxing gym, he understood instantly this was his arena. This was where boys became men. The air smelled of sweat and leather. Heavy bags swung from chains. Fighters pounded them with fists and shins until the walls echoed with thuds. Andrew watched, fascinated. Here, there was no lying, no hiding. You couldn't fake toughness. The ring told the truth. When he wrapped his hands and put on gloves for the first time, he felt a surge of energy unlike anything else. The training was brutal. His body ached. He got punched, kicked, and humiliated by more experienced fighters. But deep down, he loved it. Pain didn't scare him, it motivated him. Andrew had found the battlefield that would shape him. But he had no idea yet that this path would lead to both triumph and a brutal realization about how the world really works. Kickboxing became Andrew's obsession. He trained with a ferocity that shocked even his coaches. While other young fighters skipped days, went out drinking, or looked for excuses, Andrew was in the gym before dawn. He didn't just want to participate, he wanted to dominate. The workouts were merciless. Hours of sparring until his body begged him to stop. Running in freezing weather, legs numb, lungs burning. Drilling techniques over and over until his shins bled from striking pads. For most people, this kind of suffering breaks the spirit. For Andrew, it became fuel. He told himself, if I can endure more pain than anyone else, I can beat anyone. Soon, he began competing. His first fights were small local venues, small crowds, no glamour. But for him, each fight was life or death. He fought with a hunger that could not be taught. And slowly, victory after victory, his name began to spread. But every fight taught him more than just how to throw punches. It taught him about himself. Fear is loud before the bell rings. But once the first punch lands, fear disappears. Pain becomes a background noise. And what's left is willpower. One night, during an early career fight, he faced an opponent far more experienced. The crowd didn't believe Andrew could win. In the first round, he was battered, knocked down, almost finished. But in the corner, gasping for breath, he remembered his father's lessons. Losing is not an option if you refuse to quit. Round after round, he clawed his way back. Every strike was thrown with desperation, every kick with rage against failure. By the end, Andrew's hand was raised. The crowd was shocked. For Andrew, it was confirmation. He could outlast anyone. Over the next years, his record grew. He became a world champion. Belts, trophies, respect all earned in blood. The boy who once sat in silence at a chessboard was now a man feared in the ring. And yet, as the victories piled up, a new truth emerged. The glory was intoxicating, but the bank account was empty. Prize money barely covered living expenses. The world applauded champions in the ring, but outside the ropes, they struggled to pay rent. This realization hit Andrew harder than any punch ever had. He had proven himself as a fighter, but in financial terms, he was still a pawn. The fighter had conquered his body, but he was about to learn the harshest lesson of all. The world does not reward strength, it rewards strategy. By his mid-20s, Andrew Tate was a world champion kickboxer. To the outside world, he looked successful. Medals, belts, highlight reels of knockouts. But behind the scenes, life was different. He was broke. And worse, he was trapped. The brutal truth about fighting is that it's temporary. Every punch shortens your career. Every injury takes years off your body. Andrew realized with growing dread, if he kept fighting, he would end up with nothing but scars. One night, sitting in a cheap apartment with Tristan, his younger brother, Andrew, faced the reality. The glory didn't matter. What mattered was freedom. And freedom meant money. Real money. Not fight purses. Not applause. Wealth. That conversation with Tristan planted a seed. Andrew decided, I will not spend my life trading punches for pennies. I will learn the game of money, just like I learned the game of fighting. It wasn't an easy transition. At first, he had no idea where to begin. He tried hustles, some reckless, some smart, some failures, some small wins. But each attempt gave him data, just like sparring sessions taught him which moves worked and which didn't. The key shift was mental. He stopped seeing himself as just a fighter. He began to see himself as a strategist in a new arena, the economy. For the first time, he understood what his father meant when he compared life to chess. Fighting had taught him to endure. Business would teach him to build. From that day, Andrew's life took a new direction. The ring had forged his discipline, but now he was ready to apply it elsewhere. He was no longer just a warrior. He was becoming something more dangerous. A warrior with a plan. This was the origin story. The beginning of the transformation. Andrew Tate had survived the fire of the ring. Now he would enter a new battlefield, one even more ruthless than kickboxing. The ring does not forgive weakness. And Andrew Tate knew this better than anyone. By the time he committed fully to kickboxing, his life had become a cycle of discipline and pain. Every day started before sunrise. While the city slept, Andrew was already running miles through cold streets, his breath cutting the air like smoke. He ran not for fitness, but for domination. Every step, every bead of sweat was a message to himself. I will outwork everyone. At the gym, the sessions were brutal. Hours of sparring until his face was swollen and his ribs bruised. Endless drills, punches, kicks, combinations repeated until his body screamed for mercy. His shins bled from striking pads. His knuckles split open from pounding bags. But quitting was not an option. Andrew had already made a vow. If I can suffer more than you, I will beat you. Most fighters train until they're tired. Andrew trained until his body collapsed. And then he trained some more. Pain became his companion. He didn't run from it. He embraced it. Because in his mind, pain was the currency of greatness. And it wasn't just physical. The mental battles were worse. Every morning, he faced the voice inside that whispered, "Stay in bed. Rest. You've done enough." He killed that voice daily. He forced himself to act, even when his body wanted to stop. That discipline, that refusal to negotiate with weakness, became his edge. The gym became his sanctuary and his battlefield. Fighters came and went, some talented, some tough, but few stayed consistent. Andrew noticed the pattern early. Talent fades when pressure rises, discipline endures, and discipline was his weapon. One of his coaches once said, "Andrew Tate, the most naturally gifted fighter I've trained, but he is the hardest to break. And that makes him dangerous." The fights began to stack. Small promotions, dimly lit venues, local crowds, shouting, betting, cheering. For Andrew, each fight was more than sport, it was survival. When the bell rang, there were no excuses. No luck, just him and another man who wanted to destroy him. The ring became the purest test of will he had ever known. He lost some fights early on, losses that cut deep, losses that humiliated. But Andrew didn't see them as defeats. He studied them the way his father studied chess matches. Every punch he failed to block, every mistake in footwork, every lapse in timing, he analyzed it all. Then he returned to the gym and corrected it. Piece by piece, fight by fight, he built himself into a weapon of precision and brutality. Soon, the results became undeniable. He wasn't just winning, he was breaking opponents. Fighters who looked confident before the bell quickly unraveled under his relentless pressure. He absorbed their shots, kept moving forward, kept striking. Many men quit in front of him, not because they lacked skill, but because they lacked his will. Andrew had discovered his formula. Discipline plus suffering equals invincibility. But behind the victories, there was a cost. His body carried scars, bones cracked, ribs broken, concussions endured. Nights where he could barely move, mornings where he woke up aching everywhere. Yet he didn't complain. To him, pain was proof. Proof that he had pushed past comfort. Proof that he was walking a path most men would never dare to tread. And it was paying off. Titles followed. Recognition grew. He was no longer just a fighter, he was a champion in the making. But deep inside, Andrew knew something his opponents didn't. This was only the beginning. The ring had given him confidence, but it hadn't yet given him what he truly wanted. Because, in Andrew's mind, victory inside the ring was only half the battle. The greater war was outside, against mediocrity, against weakness. Against a world designed to keep men small. Kickboxing was just his training ground. Victory changes a man. The first time Andrew's hand was raised under the bright lights, the referee holding his wrist high as the crowd roared, he felt it. The sting of every bruise, the burn in his lungs, the hours of punishment in training, they all vanished in that moment. Winning wasn't just pleasure. It was confirmation that the suffering had been worth it. From that day, he was hooked. Andrew fought with an intensity that drew attention. He wasn't just technical, he wasn't just fast, he was relentless. Opponents who expected him to fade discovered the opposite. He grew stronger as the fight dragged on. His style wasn't pretty, but it was effective. Break your opponent's spirit before the final bell, and it worked. Victories began piling up. Small shows turned into bigger promotions. His name appeared on posters. Crowds grew louder. Slowly, Andrew Tate was no longer just another fighter. He was becoming the fighter people came to see. But for him, every fight was more than a contest, it was a test of character. He studied his rivals before stepping into the ring. He looked for fear in their eyes, doubt in their posture. and when the bell rang, he made sure they felt his presence. Every strike wasn't just an attack, it was a question. How badly do you really want this? Most men broke before answering. His hunger pushed him into championship fights. These were the nights that defined careers. The pressure was suffocating, the lights blinding, the audience massive. But for Andrew, the ring was home. He thrived under the spotlight. He told himself, "They can't hurt me more than I've already hurt myself in training." Fight after fight, belt after belt, he carved his name into the sport. A world champion multiple times over. For a boy who once sat quietly over a chessboard, the transformation was complete. He was now a man respected, feared, and admired in equal measure. And yet, beneath the triumphs, a darker truth lingered. The paychecks were small. The glamour was an illusion. Fans cheered his victories. But when the lights went out, reality remained. Kickboxing was not boxing. It wasn't the UFC. It was a niche sport, respected but underfunded. A world champion could walk into the arena with glory and walk out to a life of financial struggle. Andrew began to notice the cracks. After winning a title, he returned home to a modest apartment. The belt gleamed on the shelf, but bills still piled up on the table. His body was battered, his mind exhausted. And for what? Recognition, applause. Neither paid the rent. It was a sobering realization. He had conquered the ring, but the world outside didn't care. Friends congratulated him. Strangers admired him. But admiration doesn't buy freedom. He still had to count expenses, still had to wonder if the next fight purse would cover his living costs. The contrast was jarring: public glory, private scarcity. Andrew began to see fighting for what it truly was. Not a career, but a stepping stone. A test that had given him discipline, toughness, and resilience, but not the wealth he sought. And so, while he continued to fight, a new thought crept into his mind. If I can master this, I can master something else. Something bigger. Something that will not just test me, but free me. The seeds of his next evolution were planted in those moments of reflection. In the silence of his apartment, surrounded by the smell of sweat and liniment, he realized that being a champion was not enough. If he wanted freedom, if he wanted power, he needed to step into a new kind of fight, the fight for wealth. The crowd roared. Flashing lights, cameras, and chants of his name filled the arena. Andrew Tate had done it, again another victory, another belt raised high above his head. On that stage, he was unstoppable. A world champion, a warrior, a man who had proven himself against the toughest in the sport. But when the adrenaline faded, when the cameras turned off and the crowd went home, reality returned with brutal clarity. He would leave the arena not in a limousine, but in a taxi. He would walk into an apartment where the fridge was half empty, where unpaid bills sat on the kitchen table. The belt glittered under the lamp, but it was nothing more than decoration. It couldn't pay the rent. That contrast cut deep. On one hand, the glory of combat, the cheers, the respect, the recognition. On the other, the silence of financial struggle. Andrew began asking himself a dangerous question. What is the point of glory if it doesn't buy freedom? The truth was unavoidable. Kickboxing had given him discipline, strength, and identity. But it wasn't going to make him rich. Unlike boxing superstars or UFC champions, kickboxers lived in the shadows of the sports world. Their bodies carried the same scars, their minds endured the same struggles. But their bank accounts told a different story. Andrew had sacrificed everything for this sport. Years of pain, broken bones, endless hours of training, while others lived normal lives. And yet, at the height of his career, he was barely surviving financially. He began to see the fight game with new eyes. The promoters made money, the networks made money, The arenas made money. Everyone profited from his blood except him. He was a gladiator in the modern age. Adored in the arena, discarded outside it. That realization gnawed at him. For the first time, he felt a deeper hunger than victory. He didn't just want to win fights anymore. He wanted control. He wanted wealth. He wanted freedom from the system that cheered for him, but never rewarded him. He often sat with his brother Tristan, discussing the future. Both had been forged in the same fire. Both had fought for recognition, and both were beginning to see through the illusion. They agreed on one truth. The real fight was not in the ring, it was in the economy. It was during one of those nights that Andrew made a decision that would change his life. He looked at the belts, polished and gleaming on the shelf, and felt nothing. They were symbols, yes, but empty ones. If I can master this, he thought, I can master something else. Something that will actually pay. And so, while he continued fighting, his mind shifted. He started reading about business, experimenting with ventures, observing how money moved in the world. He was no longer just a kickboxer. He was a strategist, preparing for a new arena, one where punches didn't matter, but power did. The ring had been his teacher. Pain had been his tutor. Discipline had been his inheritance. Now, it was time to take those weapons and use them where they mattered most. Because Andrew Tate understood something most fighters never realize. Physical glory fades, but wealth endures. Andrew Tate had conquered the ring. He was a multiple-time world champion, respected in the kickboxing community, admired by fans who saw him as a warrior. But the belts collecting dust in his apartment were not paying the bills. And the deeper truth gnawed at him. Glory without wealth is nothing. He had proven his strength in combat. Now, he needed to prove his strength in life. For Andrew, the transition began not with success, but with confusion. Fighting had been simple. Train harder, fight smarter, endure more pain than your opponent. Business, however, was a different battlefield. The rules were invisible. The players were hidden. And the punishment for mistakes wasn't a black eye, it was financial ruin. Still, Andrew carried one advantage. The mindset of a fighter. He knew how to take hits. He knew how to learn through pain. And so, he threw himself into the unknown. His first attempts were clumsy. He experimented with different hustles, some small, some ambitious. He invested time into ventures that failed quickly. He partnered with people he shouldn't have trusted. Money slipped through his hands as easily as it came. But Andrew refused to see failure as defeat. Just like in kickboxing, every setback was feedback. Every loss was data. He remembers one of his first ventures vividly. It was supposed to be his ticket out of financial struggle. He poured time, energy, and hope into it. But within months, it collapsed. The money was gone. His effort had been wasted. Most people would have quit. Andrew didn't. He sat down, analyzed every mistake, and told himself, "Good. Now I know what not to do." This cycle repeated itself. Try, fail, learn. Try again, fail again, learn again. Each loss hardened him. Each failure sharpened his instincts. Slowly, he began to understand that business, like fighting, is about strategy. You don't need to win every exchange. You just need to stay standing when the other man quits. The difference was that in business, your opponent isn't always in front of you. Sometimes your opponent is the market. Sometimes it's human behavior. Sometimes it's your own lack of knowledge. But Andrew's advantage was relentless persistence. While others got discouraged, he pushed harder. Still, the road was brutal. There were nights when he wondered if he had made a mistake leaving kickboxing. At least, in the ring, he knew the rules. Here, he was stumbling in the dark. The punches were financial, but they hurt just as much. The harsh reality was this: the world didn't care that he was a champion. Outside the ring, he was just another man trying to survive. The respect he earned in combat meant nothing in the marketplace. Nobody was impressed by his belts when rent was due. That truth was humbling, but also liberating. It forced him to accept that if he wanted real freedom, he had to start from scratch. He had to learn the rules of a new game. And just like the young boy who once stepped into a kickboxing gym for the first time, he embraced being the beginner. Because Andrew Tate knew one thing for certain: he had no intention of being ordinary. Failure in business doesn't leave bruises on your face. It leaves scars on your pride, on your bank account, on your confidence. For Andrew Tate, stepping into the world of entrepreneurship was like stepping into the ring blindfolded. And the punches came hard. His first ventures were messy. He invested in ideas that sounded good in theory, but collapsed under reality. Some businesses failed because he trusted the wrong people partners, who promised loyalty but disappeared when money got tight. Others failed because he lacked experience. He spent money recklessly, believing success would come faster than it did. The results were painful. Bank accounts drained, projects abandoned, friends whispering that he should get a real job, critics laughing that the kickboxer thought he could be a businessman. Andrew had been humiliated before, in the ring, knocked down, battered, underestimated, but this was different. Losing a fight stung, but it was temporary. Losing money, losing momentum, losing face in the business world, it cut deeper. There were nights when he stared at his computer screen, numbers in red, and thought, maybe they're right. Maybe I should have stayed in fighting. But then he caught himself. That voice, the voice of doubt, was the same one he killed every morning in training. He refused to let it control him now. For Andrew, failure was never the end. It was a step. He remembered how many times he lost in sparring before he became a champion. Business was no different. Each failure had a price, and he was willing to pay it. He began to look at failure differently. To most people, losing money is tragedy. To Andrew, it became tuition. This is the cost of learning, he told himself. Some people pay universities. I pay the market. Slowly, his mindset hardened. He stopped chasing easy wins. He started studying human behavior, markets, persuasion, and leverage. He noticed patterns, what made people buy, what kept businesses alive, what caused others to collapse. He also discovered something darker. Most people don't fail because they're unlucky. They fail because they quit too soon. In kickboxing, he had seen fighters break not from punches, but from pressure. In business, it was the same. Most entrepreneurs didn't lose everything, they simply lost patience. Andrew refused to be one of them. Still, the sacrifices piled up. There were months when he lived with almost nothing, pouring every resource into trying again. There were days when even Tristan, his brother and closest ally, questioned whether the struggle was worth it. But Andrew was unshakable. He had burned the boats. There was no going back. And then, through the smoke of failures, came small sparks of progress. A project that didn't collapse. A business idea that actually worked. The amounts were small. The wins humble, but they were wins nonetheless. And with each one, he felt momentum building. The pain of failure had forged him again, just as kickboxing once had. The bruises were invisible, but the lessons were permanent. Every setback leaves a mark. In kickboxing, the mark is on your body. A scar above the eye, a rib that never quite heals. In business, the marks are invisible, but they cut just as deep. And Andrew Tate carried many of them, but instead of hiding his wounds, he studied them. He treated every failure as if it were a sparring session, an opportunity to analyze, to adapt, to evolve. This was the fighter's mindset applied to money. Where most men saw loss, he saw data. Where most men saw final defeat, he saw temporary feedback. One of the first lessons he carved into his mind was simple. Never trust words, only results. Too many times he had relied on promises from partners only to be betrayed. Too many times he had believed in opportunities that turned out to be illusions. He realized quickly that in business, as in fighting, your opponent will exploit every weakness if you let them. Naivety was dangerous. The second lesson: discipline beats motivation. It's easy to be excited at the start of a new venture. Everyone has energy on day 1. But what about day 100? When the excitement has burned out and all that remains is grind. That's where discipline separates winners from losers. Andrew understood this well. He had dragged himself through freezing morning runs when his body begged for rest. Now he dragged himself through long nights studying business, refining systems, learning from trial and error. The third lesson: failure is not a signal to stop, it's the entry fee. He began to view losses as tuition payments to the school of wealth. Every failed venture was expensive, but it bought him knowledge. And unlike money, knowledge compounds. Slowly, patterns began to emerge. He recognized how money flowed, how influence worked, how attention could be turned into currency. He noticed that while many people were smarter or better connected, very few had his resilience. They quit when things got uncomfortable. He didn't. That became his edge. This is where Andrew began to shift. He stopped thinking like a fighter chasing purses and started thinking like an architect building an empire. Fighting had taught him intensity. Business taught him leverage. And he realized something profound. In combat sports, one man fights another. But in business, one man can fight thousands. He builds the right system. The more he learned, the more he understood that wealth is not about working harder, it's about working smarter, about controlling systems, about multiplying effort through strategy. It was chess all over again, but now the stakes were freedom, not trophies. And perhaps the most important lesson he took from this battlefield was this: society is not built for you to win. The system is designed to keep people obedient, comfortable, and weak. The schools teach conformity, not wealth. The jobs teach dependence, not freedom. He had seen it clearly in fighting the world, cheered for gladiators, then discarded them. Now he saw it in business. The world dangled false promises to keep people in line. But Andrew Tate was not going to be one of those people. Armed with the scars of failure and the discipline of a champion, he prepared for his next evolution. He wasn't just a fighter anymore. He wasn't just a hustler making random moves. He was becoming something more dangerous. A man who understood the rules of the game, and who was ready to bend them to his will. The harsh reality had not broken him. It had forged him. And with those lessons carved into his mind, Andrew was ready to build the foundations of his empire. Andrew Tate had learned the hard way that the world outside the ring didn't care about belts or titles. What it cared about was money. Freedom had a price, and he was determined to pay it. But where do you start when you know nothing about business? For Andrew, the answer was simple. Anywhere. He would try everything. He would throw himself into the hustle the same way he once threw himself into kickboxing head first. Relentless, with no fear of failure. The early days of this journey were chaotic. Andrew dabbled in anything that promised cash. Some hustles were small, almost laughable. Others were ambitious but flawed. He tried trading, marketing schemes, online ventures, even physical businesses. Most failed, some collapsed within weeks. But Andrew never expected success on the first try. He wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking for information. Each hustle was an experiment. Each failure, a lesson. One of his first attempts was brutally simple. Flipping items for profit, buying low, selling high. It wasn't glamorous, but it taught him something. Vital money is always moving, and the man who understands where it flows will never go broke. He also experimented with online opportunities, websites, early digital marketing tactics, small online services. None of them made him rich, but each opened his eyes to a new truth. The internet was a battlefield far bigger than any boxing ring. Here, attention was the currency, and those who mastered it controlled wealth. But the hustle wasn't just about business mechanics. It was about mindset. Andrew quickly realized that most people fail not because the opportunity doesn't exist, but because they lack consistency. They dabble, they half commit, they quit the moment results don't show up instantly. He, on the other hand, was willing to grind, to repeat, to suffer. There were days when he made barely enough to cover expenses. Days when friends questioned why he didn't settle for a normal job. But Andrew had burned that bridge long ago. He would rather fail on his own path than succeed on someone else's leash. He told himself, "Every dollar I make on my own terms is worth more than 10 earned in slavery." Slowly, his mindset sharpened. The hustle was not about getting rich overnight. It was about building the muscle of resilience, the instinct of opportunity. Just as sparring had prepared him for real fights, these experiments were preparing him for real wealth. One important realization struck him during this phase. The rich don't work harder than everyone else, they work smarter. They understand leverage, they use systems, networks, and influence. Andrew began to study this with the same intensity he once studied fighting techniques. The hustle was teaching him what schools never did, that money is not about time, but about value. And the man who can create value at scale, who can multiply his efforts, becomes unstoppable. He wasn't there yet. The profits were small, inconsistent, but the lessons were priceless. And slowly, Andrew Tate was transforming again. Not from boy to fighter, he had already walked that path. This time, he was transforming from fighter to entrepreneur, from gladiator to strategist, from someone who endured pain to someone who understood leverage. The hustles were crude, but they were sharpening him for something much greater. Every failed hustle left Andrew with something more valuable than money: perspective. And with each perspective came a deeper shift in mindset. He began to realize that entrepreneurship was not just about finding the right opportunity, it was about becoming the right kind of person. The hustler's mindset is simple in theory, but brutal in practice. Nobody is coming to save you. The government won't save you. Employers won't save you. Friends won't save you. If you want freedom, you have to build it with your own 2 hands. Most people, Andrew noticed, are trained to think like employees. They wait for permission, for instructions, for security. They believe the paycheck is safety. But to him, the paycheck was chains, a prison disguised as comfort. The hustler's path had no guaranteed salary, no certainty, no comfort. But it had one thing the paycheck never offered: possibility. He started living by a set of principles. The first, speed is everything. In the ring, hesitation meant pain. In business, hesitation meant missed opportunity. While others overthought, Andrew acted. He tested ideas fast. If they failed, he moved on. If they worked, he scaled them. Action created feedback. Feedback created growth. The second principle, attention is currency. He realized early that in the modern world, it doesn't matter if you have the best product, the best skill, or the best idea. If nobody knows you exist, you're invisible. Influence was power. Those who could capture attention could direct money. The third principle: outwork everyone. It wasn't just about raw hours, it was about intensity. Andrew worked with the same obsession he brought to kickboxing. While others binge-watched TV, he was learning marketing. While others slept, he was building online ventures. To him, every wasted hour was theft from his future self. But perhaps the most important principle was this: never complain. He noticed that average people always had excuses why they couldn't start, why they couldn't succeed, why the system was unfair. Andrew didn't deny the system was unfair. He embraced it. Yes, the game is rigged, he thought, so play differently. Bend the rules, find loopholes, adapt faster. This attitude made him polarizing. Some admired his hunger. Others called him arrogant, reckless, unrealistic. But Andrew didn't care. Approval never made anyone rich. He measured respect by results. During this phase, he began to document his ideas, writing down what worked and what didn't. Slowly, a philosophy was forming, one that combined the ruthless discipline of fighting with the opportunistic sharpness of entrepreneurship. He wasn't just chasing money, he was building a framework, a way of thinking that would eventually become his brand. The hustler's mindset wasn't about finding one big win. It was about stacking small wins, day after day, until momentum became unstoppable. Andrew compared it to sparring at first. You take more hits than you land, but over time, you learn patterns. You start anticipating moves. You begin to dominate. And that was exactly what he planned to do, not just in business, but in life. He told himself, I don't want to make a living. I want to make an empire. Every fighter knows the moment when the tide shifts, when the punches that once staggered you no longer hurt. When the rhythm of the fight finally belongs to you. In business, Andrew Tate began to feel that same shift. After countless failures, small sparks of success started to appear. The ventures were not glamorous. There was no overnight jackpot, no magic formula. Instead, progress came through persistence. One online project brought in a little income. Another hustle generated slightly more. On their own, these wins were small. But together, they signaled something crucial. The system was starting to work. For Andrew, the first real breakthrough wasn't the money itself, it was the proof of concept. He had gone from zero to something, and something was infinitely more than nothing. It meant his theories were right. Wealth wasn't reserved for the chosen few. It was available to those who dared to play the game differently. He began refining his approach. Instead of scattering his energy across dozens of ventures, he doubled down on the ones that showed promise. He learned how to scale, how to turn small wins into sustainable streams of income. It wasn't yet an empire, but it was foundation. And with every small victory came confidence. Not arrogance, but certainty. The certainty that freedom was possible. During this stage, Andrew discovered another truth. Momentum is power. The hardest step is the first. Once you create even a small stream of income on your own terms, your perspective changes forever. You stop thinking in terms of survival and start thinking in terms of growth. He began to see himself differently. He was no longer just an ex-fighter stumbling through business. He was a strategist, learning how to bend the rules of the system. Every dollar earned outside a job reinforced his belief that he was on the right path. The small sparks of success also revealed another advantage: compounding effort. Just as fitness builds slowly one workout at a time, wealth builds the same way. Each hustle taught him something that could be applied to the next. Each lesson shortened the learning curve. What once took months of trial and error now took weeks. sometimes days. It was at this point that Andrew's hunger deepened. Success, even small success, is addictive. He began thinking bigger. If he could generate a little income online, why not scale it 100 times? If influence mattered, why not build a brand powerful enough to attract millions? The vision of an empire no longer seemed like fantasy. It was a target. Of course, critics still mocked him. Friends rolled their eyes. "It's just luck," they said. "It won't last." But Andrew didn't need validation. He had validation from the only place that mattered: results, and deep down, he knew these first sparks of success were not the end. They were the beginning. Just as winning his first amateur fight didn't make him a world champion, these small business wins didn't make him wealthy. But they proved the path was real. And that was enough, he told himself. The ring taught me discipline. Failure taught me strategy. The hustle is teaching me leverage. Now, it's only a matter of time. The ring had given Andrew Tate more than titles. It had given him discipline. Years of pushing his body to its absolute limit. Years of fighting through pain. Years of waking up when every fiber of his being wanted to stay in bed. And now, outside the ring, he realized this discipline was his greatest weapon. Most men crumble when they leave their arena. The athlete who retires drifts into obscurity. The soldier who leaves the battlefield struggles with purpose. But Andrew refused to be another man trapped by his past. The lessons of kickboxing were not limited to fighting, they were transferable. Business, he discovered, was simply another fight. The opponent wasn't flesh and blood, but it was just as ruthless. The competition wanted to crush you. The market wanted to humiliate you. Weakness was punished. Complacency was fatal. It was the same war, only fought with different weapons. So Andrew carried his fighter's discipline into this new battlefield. He structured his days like training camps. Wake early, attack the hardest tasks first. Push until exhaustion. Repeat. There was no motivation, no waiting to feel ready. Just discipline, executed daily. When he studied business, he studied with the same intensity he once studied opponents' fight tapes. When he built systems, he built them with the same precision as fight strategies. When he lost money, he treated it like sparring, damage painful, yes, but necessary for growth. He told himself, in the ring, I won because I suffered more than my opponent. In business, I will win the same way, and he meant it. While others were distracted, chasing comfort, Andrew was grinding. The same way he stayed in the gym hours longer than everyone else. He stayed in the hustle longer. The average entrepreneur gave up after a year. Andrew doubled down. The greatest realization he had during this transition was that most people fail not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack pain tolerance. They can't endure the grind. They want the reward without the suffering. For Andrew, suffering was home. It was familiar. In his mind, every obstacle was simply another opponent. Every failed venture was another round lost. But as long as he didn't quit, the fight wasn't over. This mentality created an unstoppable engine. While others were asking, how long will this take? Andrew asked, how far can I go? While others looked for easy profits, Andrew looked for endurance. The fighter in him was reborn, not with gloves and mouthguards, but with spreadsheets and strategies. The arena had changed. The rules had changed. But the warrior remained. Because discipline doesn't care about the battlefield. Discipline wins everywhere. Pain is the most honest teacher. In the ring, Andrew Tate had learned to welcome its broken ribs, bloodied lips, the crushing weight of exhaustion. Each scar was proof that he had chosen the path of resistance, the path of growth. Now, outside the ring, he discovered that business carried its own kind of pain. But this time, it wasn't fists and kicks. It was the sting of financial loss, the humiliation of failure, the frustration of watching plans collapse after months of effort. Most men run from that pain. They drown it in distractions, complain about the unfairness of life, or retreat back into comfort. Andrew did the opposite. He embraced it. He began to view pain not as punishment, but as fuel. Every failure, every loss, every setback lit a fire in him. When a business collapsed, he didn't sulk, he became more determined. When critics mocked him, he used their words as motivation. Pain was no longer something to avoid. It was energy to be harnessed. He told himself, if I can endure the physical pain of being kicked in the head, I can endure the financial pain of losing money. The only difference is the arena. This mindset gave him an edge. In business, setbacks are inevitable. But while most entrepreneurs saw setbacks as reasons to quit, Andrew saw them as signs he was on the right path. After all, if there's no resistance, there's no growth. He compared it to training. The body doesn't grow without stress. Muscles only strengthen after being torn down. The same principle applied to wealth. His failures were simply the stress needed to break down old ways of thinking, forcing him to rebuild stronger, and pain gave him clarity. He noticed how most people hide from discomfort, which is why they never advance. They want certainty, comfort, and safety. But in chasing those things, they trade away freedom. Andrew realized that the man who can endure the most discomfort wins not just in fighting, but in life. Every late night when he stared at a screen, every morning when exhaustion tried to hold him in bed, he remembered the same mantra. Pain is temporary. Quitting lasts forever. There were moments, of course, when doubt tried to creep in, when the numbers didn't add up, when ventures collapsed, when even Tristan, his brother and closest ally, questioned the grind. But Andrew always returned to the same truth. If he could suffer through kickboxing, he could suffer through this. This was the reinvention. He was no longer fighting opponents, he was fighting weakness. He was fighting the temptation of comfort, the lure of giving up, the seductive voice of good enough. And every time he chose pain over comfort, he grew stronger. What others called failure, he called sharpening. What others called suffering, he called fuel. And slowly, the momentum built. Pain became not just something he endured, but something he sought. Because he understood that the deeper the pain, the greater the transformation waiting on the other side. Andrew Tate wasn't just learning business, he was learning to weaponize adversity. In fighting, one punch rarely wins the match. Victory comes from a sequence: a jab, a cross, a kick, each strike adding up until the opponent breaks. Andrew Tate realized that business worked the same way. Success was not about one giant win. It was about stacking small victories until the momentum became unstoppable. After years of pain, discipline, and failures, Andrew began to see patterns emerge. Some ventures, once refined, actually worked. They didn't make him rich overnight, but they generated steady income. And unlike fight purses, which came once every few months, these businesses produced results daily. The first time he woke up and saw money in his account that had appeared while he slept, everything changed. For the first time, his work had detached from his time. He wasn't trading hours for dollars. He was building systems. And systems didn't sleep. That small taste of freedom was intoxicating. It wasn't millions. It wasn't glamorous. But it was proof that the formula worked. And proof is more powerful than hope. Andrew doubled down. He refined what worked, cut what didn't, and focused his energy with the same precision he once used in the ring. Each small business became another brick in his foundation. Each stream of income another weapon in his arsenal. He compared it to a fight camp. Every workout, lifting, running, sparring seemed small on its own, but together they created a champion. In the same way, every hustle, every business, every system seemed small at first, but together they built momentum. And momentum is the most dangerous force in the world. The victories were modest at first, hundreds here, thousands there, but the confidence they built was massive. Each win silenced doubt. Each stream of income proved that financial freedom was not a dream, it was a matter of execution. Andrew also began to notice another advantage: compounding. Skills he learned in one hustle could be applied to the next. Lessons from one failure helped him avoid mistakes in another. Over time, his progress accelerated. The man who once stumbled blindly through business was now moving with intent, strategy, and growing certainty. This was the reinvention. Andrew Tate was no longer simply a fighter who dabbled in business. He was a fighter turned strategist, stacking victories with ruthless discipline. But beyond the money, something else was changing his identity. He was building not just income, but confidence in a new arena. He was proving to himself that he wasn't chained to the ring, that he could succeed on his own terms. The same fire that had pushed him through kickboxing championships was now pushing him toward financial independence. And he understood something most people never grasp. Once you stack enough small wins, they snowball into something unstoppable. For Andrew, the snowball had begun to roll. The empire was still far away, but the foundation was laid. He told himself, "In fighting, I became a champion by stacking rounds, not punches. In life, I will become free by stacking victories, not dreams." Up to this point, Andrew Tate had fought two kinds of battles. One in the ring, one in the world of hustling. Both had taught him discipline, resilience, and strategy. But as he studied wealth more deeply, one truth became crystal clear. In the modern world, attention is more valuable than gold. It didn't matter how skilled you were, how sharp your mind was, or how hard you worked. If nobody knew who you were invisible. And invisible men don't build empires. Andrew began to understand that money follows influence. People don't just buy products, they buy identities. They don't just listen to advice, they follow personalities. If he wanted to escape the cycle of hustles and step into real wealth, he needed to do more than run businesses in the shadows. He needed to build a brand. This realization sparked a transformation. Andrew decided that he would no longer be just another entrepreneur grinding in silence. He would become a symbol, a character, a figure that people couldn't ignore. And so, brick by brick, he began crafting a persona. Not a mask, but an amplified version of himself. The confidence he had in the ring, the discipline forged in years of training, the sharpness he gained through failures, all of it could be projected outward. He would embody the man he believed every man could become. Strong, disciplined, wealthy, and unapologetically bold. He realized that in an age of endless scrolling, you only have seconds to capture attention. Subtlety doesn't work. Playing small doesn't work. To cut through the noise, you must be larger than life. Polarizing, unapologetic, and Andrew Tate was ready to be exactly that. The early days of this persona were extremely. He began speaking more openly about his philosophy, the lies of modern society, the weakness encouraged in men, the necessity of discipline and wealth. His delivery was sharp, direct, often abrasive, but it wasn't by accident. He understood that people don't remember what makes them comfortable. They remember what shocks them, what challenges them, what forces them to react. For every person who dismissed him as arrogant, There were 10 who listened closely, drawn to the rawness of his words. Whether they agreed or disagreed didn't matter. What mattered was that they were listening. This was the first stage of his brand. Visibility. Once invisible, Andrew was now stepping into the spotlight, and with visibility came opportunity. He began to notice that when people paid attention to his words, they also became curious about his ventures, his lifestyle, his businesses. Influence wasn't just about ego, it was about leverage. The bigger the brand, the bigger the opportunities. He told himself, fighting made me strong, business made me smart, but branding will make me unstoppable. This was no longer about hustles, this was about empire. Every empire needs a flag. Every leader needs an identity. For Andrew Tate, that identity would become Top G. The phrase started small, almost as a joke between him and his brother Tristan. But like all powerful ideas, it carried weight. Top G wasn't just a nickname. It was a statement. It meant being at the top of the game. Strength, in wealth, in confidence, in life. And Andrew realized quickly that this persona could be weaponized. The world was full of ordinary men, living quiet, safe lives, men afraid to take risks, men trapped in jobs they hated, in routines that drained their spirit. Andrew positioned Top G as the opposite, the man who refuses compromise, the man who takes what he wants, the man who plays the game of life on his own terms. But Andrew knew that identity alone wasn't enough. Image needed proof. Words needed weight. So he began to craft a lifestyle that reinforced the persona. The cars, the watches, the tailored suits, the mansions. Each piece wasn't just for personal enjoyment. It was part of the brand. Symbols of power, carefully displayed, designed to provoke both admiration and envy. He understood human psychology. People don't follow words, they follow results. They don't believe theories, they believe what they can see. When Andrew filmed himself stepping out of a supercar or sitting in a penthouse, he wasn't just showing off, he was sending a message. I lived the life you dream of, and I did it by refusing to be ordinary. The brilliance of Top G was that it wasn't an act. It was an amplification. Andrew had always been bold, disciplined, unfiltered. The persona simply magnified those traits and turned them into a brand that demanded attention. And attention was everything. Online, his presence grew rapidly. Clips of his speeches and rants spread across platforms. Some praised him as a role model. Others condemned him as toxic. But both sides shared the content. Both sides fed the fire. Andrew had created something magnetic. People couldn't ignore him. The controversy was by design. He knew that playing it safe meant being forgotten. If you wanted to stand out in the digital arena, you had to polarize. You had to make people feel something: admiration, anger, envy, respect. Neutrality was death. And so Top G became a lightning rod. Young men, especially, gravitated to his message of strength, wealth, and independence. They saw in him the father figure, the older brother, the mentor that modern society denied them. Critics saw arrogance. Supporters saw liberation. Either way, the brand grew stronger. Andrew leaned fully into this identity. Every appearance, every word, every visual reinforced the image of Top G. He was consistent, relentless, and strategic. While others treated social media as entertainment, he treated it as war. The result: Andrew Tate was no longer just a man. He was a brand. And brands don't fade. When the person rests, they live on, multiplying influence, compounding reach, creating opportunities. He told himself, fighters are remembered for a season. Businessmen are remembered for a decade. But brands can live forever. Top G was more than a character. It was his empire's foundation. Attention is the new oil. Influence is the new currency. Andrew Tate understood this better than most. In the ring, he had proven that strength could win battles. In business, he had proven that discipline and persistence could create income. But now, he discovered a force even greater: the ability to shape how millions of people think, feel, and act. That was the true power of influence. At first, Andrew's online presence was small. A handful of videos, a growing following, a reputation beginning to form. But every piece of content added weight to the persona of Top G. Each clip, each quote, each moment of unapologetic honesty reinforced the image of a man who lived by different rules. And people noticed. Supporters began sharing his content with captions like, "This is the truth, no one else will say." Critics shared the same clips, mocking him, attacking him. But in the digital arena, both actions had the same effect. More reach, more influence, more power. Andrew realized that he didn't need to convince everyone. He only needed to be unforgettable. Love him or hate him, people kept watching, and that attention became leverage. Businesses thrived under his brand. His ventures gained visibility simply because they were associated with his name. Young men flocked to his courses and communities, eager to learn the mindset and strategies of Top G. What had started as hustles in the shadows was now evolving into a machine powered by attention. And influence multiplied faster than money. One viral clip could reach millions overnight. One bold statement could dominate conversations worldwide. Unlike the ring, where he had to fight one opponent at a time, here he was fighting thousands at once and winning. He began to study influence the same way he once studied fighting styles. Why do people follow certain figures? Why do some voices dominate culture while others vanish? He noticed that influence was not about being nice or agreeable. It was about certainty. People crave leaders who speak with conviction, who project confidence, who embody results. Andrew leaned into that fully. He didn't soften his edges to please critics. He sharpened them. The sharper the edge, the deeper the impact. The power of influence also opened doors. Opportunities that would have been invisible before now came directly to him: partnerships, investments, collaborations. Influence was not just about fame, it was about control. When millions listen to your voice, you don't chase opportunities, opportunities chase you. But Andrew also understood the responsibility of this power. Influence could inspire, but it could also destroy. He knew the risks. He knew the backlash. And he welcomed it. In his mind, the cost of speaking truth was always worth more than the comfort of silence. This was the final evolution of his reinvention. From fighter to hustler to brand to and with influence, the foundation of his empire was nearly complete. He told himself, the strongest man in the world is not the one who can throw the hardest punch. It's the one who can move millions with his words. And Andrew Tate had become that man. The fight had moved once again. No longer the ring, no longer small hustles. Andrew Tate's new battlefield was the digital world, social media, the most ruthless arena on earth. Unlike the ring, this arena had no weight classes, no referees, no rules. Anyone could step in. Most were ignored. But those who understood the game could rise to power faster than any politician, faster than any celebrity. In the modern world, attention was empire. Andrew understood this truth early. He knew that while money was important, attention was leverage. The man who controls attention controls narratives. He controls influence. And with influence, money flows like water. At first, his presence was small. A handful of clips, Videos of him speaking blunt truths about life, discipline, and success. He wasn't polished, he wasn't scripted, but that was the point. In a sea of fake smiles and curated content, his rawness stood out. His words cut through the noise like a blade, and the algorithm noticed. People began sharing his clips. Some agreed passionately, saying, "Finally, someone is saying what we're all thinking." Others hated him, calling him arrogant, toxic, dangerous. But in the digital world, hate fuels the fire just as much as love. Every critic who shared his videos only amplified his reach. Andrew quickly realized that social media was not just a platform, it was a weapon. And like any weapon, it needed to be used strategically. He studied virality the way he once studied opponents in the ring. Why do some videos spread? Why do some voices echo while others vanish? He learned that virality wasn't about perfection, it was about resonance. People don't share facts, they share emotions. Outrage, admiration, envy, shock. So he leaned into being polarizing. His videos weren't designed to be liked by everyone, they were designed to be unforgettable. And it worked. Clips of Andrew began circulating at lightning speed. One week, he was known in a niche corner of the internet. The next, he was everywhere: Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok. It didn't matter the platform. His face, his voice, his message cut across them all. The speed of it shocked even him. He had been famous before, but only in the ring. That was nothing compared to this. Fame in fighting was local, limited to sports fans. Fame online was global. He was no longer just Andrew Tate, the ex-kickboxer. He was Andrew Tate, the phenomenon. And the best part, he didn't need mainstream media. He didn't beg networks for interviews. He didn't wait for permission. He controlled his own distribution. Social media made him unstoppable because it gave him direct access to millions, uncensored, unfiltered, raw. But Andrew also knew this power came with volatility. The same platforms that could make you viral could erase you overnight. One ban, one algorithm shift, and it could all collapse. That's why he treated it like a fight. Every video was a punch. Every post a strike. Every reaction from the crowd was data to refine his next move. And he refused to play defense. While others worried about critics, Andrew went on offense. More content, more clips, more boldness. He believed that the man who dominates attention doesn't just survive, he thrives, he told himself. In the ring, I broke opponents with pressure. Online, I will do the same. Relentless pressure until the world cannot ignore me. And with that mindset, Andrew Tate began his social media takeover. Most people believe virality is luck. A random clip blows up, a meme spreads, and suddenly someone is famous. Andrew Tate knew better. He understood that virality, like fighting, could be engineered. It wasn't luck. It was pressure, applied relentlessly and strategically. His breakthrough came with a simple but ruthless idea. Multiply himself. Instead of relying on one account, one channel, one platform, he created an army. Not just of fans, but of distributors. People who would flood the internet with his face, his voice, his message everywhere, all at once. Andrew encouraged his followers, students, and community members to cut clips of him and repost them. The incentive? Money. He set up systems where affiliates could earn by spreading his content and driving people toward his programs. It was genius. Instead of one man fighting the algorithm, he had thousands fighting for him. The effect was explosive. Suddenly, Andrew wasn't just present online, he was omnipresent. You couldn't open TikTok without seeing a clip of him. You couldn't scroll Instagram without stumbling across his quotes. YouTube was flooded with channels republishing his content. each generating millions of views. It felt less like a marketing strategy and more like a digital invasion, and this was no accident. Andrew designed his content to be short, sharp, and polarizing. Perfect for the age of short attention spans. A 1-minute clip of him saying something brutally honest, controversial, or motivational was enough to trigger emotions, anger, admiration, envy, and emotions fuel shares. Critics asked, why does he say things that offend so many? The answer was simple. Because it worked. In the attention economy, outrage and admiration are equally valuable. Neutrality is worthless. Every clip was a spark. And because thousands of people were spreading them, the sparks created a wildfire. But the brilliance of Andrew's strategy wasn't just reach. It was leverage. While other influencers exhausted themselves creating endless content, Andrew had created a system where content replicated itself. He didn't need to post 24/7. His army did it for him. His voice echoed in thousands of variations across millions of screens without him lifting a finger. This was scalability applied to influence. The results were staggering. In a matter of months, Andrew went from being a niche X-K-ICKBOXER-turned-entrepreneur to one of the most searched men on the planet. His name dominated feeds, his quotes sparked debates, his presence became inescapable, and the attention translated into power. His courses exploded with enrollments. His businesses multiplied. Opportunities poured in. By engineering virality, Andrew had done what traditional media never could. He had hacked the algorithm and bent it to his will. Of course, the backlash was immense. Journalists condemned him. Platforms began to take notice. But by then, the strategy had already succeeded. Andrew wasn't dependent on one account, one platform, or one channel. His presence was decentralized, unstoppable, living in thousands of clips spread by others. He told himself, in fighting, I trained so my punches would break through defense. Online, I've built a system where every clip is a punch and I am throwing thousands every day. This was more than strategy. This was war. And Andrew Tate was winning. Omnipresence, the word itself sounds divine-like, something reserved for gods. But in the digital age, it was achievable. And Andrew Tate had achieved it. By the peak of his rise, you couldn't escape him. Open TikTok, there he was. Scroll Instagram, another clip. YouTube recommendations. More debates about his words. Even those who hated him admitted. He's everywhere. And that was the point. Andrew understood a principle most influencers never grasp. Visibility is victory. You don't need everyone to love you. You just need to be impossible to ignore. His strategy of decentralized content had transformed into a digital empire. Thousands of accounts, run by followers and affiliates, pumped out clips around the clock. Each one was a soldier in his army, flooding timelines, dominating conversations. It wasn't just marketing, it was psychological warfare. For his supporters, he was a role model, a modern gladiator who had escaped the system and now spoke truth to millions. They saw him as the antidote to a weak, comfort-obsessed society. His message, discipline, strength, wealth, independence, was a call to arms. For his critics, he was dangerous. They labeled him toxic, arrogant, misogynistic. Media outlets wrote hit pieces. Activists demanded bans. But every attack only amplified his reach. The louder the opposition, the more curious people became. And curiosity led to clicks. Clicks led to views. Views led to power. Andrew had hacked human psychology itself. The brilliance of his omnipresence was that it created inevitability. If you saw one clip and dismissed him, Another clip would appear tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. The repetition wore people down. Some eventually listened. Others couldn't help but engage, even if just to argue. But either way, the cycle fed his empire. He knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't want to be liked by everyone. He wanted to be remembered by everyone. Heroes are admired. Villains are feared. But both are remembered. The only true death in the digital age is obscurity. And Andrew Tate was anything but obscure. Omnipresence also created leverage in ways few could imagine. His businesses exploded, fueled by the sheer scale of his reach. He no longer had to market aggressively, his followers did it for him. He no longer had to chase opportunities, they came to him. He had become a gravitational force, pulling wealth, attention, and influence into his orbit. But Andrew also understood the risk. Omnipresence paints a target on your back. The same platforms that allowed his rise could attempt to silence him. The same media that amplified his name could turn hostile. And eventually they did. Bans, censorship, attacks from every angle. Yet, by the time the crackdown came, it was already too late. His presence had become decentralized. His clips lived on in thousands of accounts. His message had already reached millions. You can silence one voice, but you cannot silence a movement. That was the genius of omnipresence. Andrew told himself, "When I fought in the ring, my goal was to dominate one man. Online, my goal is to dominate the entire conversation. And I've won. Love him or hate him, everyone had to acknowledge him. And that, in the attention economy, is the highest form of victory. Attention without strategy is noise. Attention with strategy is power." Andrew Tate understood this distinction better than anyone. By the time he had achieved digital omnipresence, Andrew had something every entrepreneur dreams of: a global audience. Millions watched his every word, debated his every statement, copied his every move. But he knew that attention alone wasn't enough. Views and clicks don't buy freedom, money does. And so, the question became, how do you turn attention into assets? Andrew's answer was simple: systems. Instead of chasing quick wins, he built frameworks where influence could be monetized at scale. The same way he once built his body through years of disciplined training. He now built businesses designed not for short-term profit, but for long-term control. His first move was education. He realized that millions of young men weren't just entertained by his words, they were hungry for guidance. Schools had failed them. Society had weakened them. But Andrew spoke directly to their desire for strength, wealth, and independence. So he created communities, programs, and courses designed to teach what he believed schools never would: financial literacy, discipline, and the art of hustling. It was brilliant psychology. His critics thought people watched him for controversy. In reality, many followed him because they wanted a blueprint. They wanted to know how to escape the grind, how to build wealth, how to reclaim control. Andrew offered them exactly that. And they paid for it. But he didn't stop at education. He diversified. Affiliate programs, online platforms, joint ventures, AHE1, structured to maximize leverage. The key wasn't working harder. The key was building machines that multiplied effort. Machines that kept generating income even while he slept. This was the moment when Andrew truly separated himself from ordinary influencers. Most influencers rely on brand deals or ads, fragile income streams that depend on approval from corporations. Andrew built his empire to be independent. He didn't beg companies for sponsorships. He didn't need permission. He created his own economy, fueled by his influence, owned by him. And the numbers grew fast. What had once been small hustles became serious revenue streams. Tens of thousands of followers became paying customers. What began as scattered attention became a structured empire. But Andrew's mindset was never satisfied with enough. He remembered the feeling of being broke, despite being a champion. He refused to repeat that mistake. This time, he wasn't building for recognition. He was building for sovereignty. He told himself, money is freedom. Systems are power. If I control both, nobody can touch me. The empire's foundations were laid, not in silence, not in shadows, but in the full light of the digital arena. And unlike his belts which sat on shelves collecting dust, these foundations were built to last. A single source of income is a leash. Andrew Tate learned that lesson early, when kickboxing gave him glory, but left him broke. This time, he refused to make the same mistake. His empire would not depend on one stream. It would flow like a river fed by many currents, impossible to cut off. The first current was education. His courses and communities grew fast. Young men around the world, disillusioned by schools and jobs, joined his programs in search of discipline, strategies, and financial independence. For them, Andrew wasn't just a teacher, he was living proof that his methods worked. He had walked the path they dreamed of, from broke fighter to wealthy entrepreneur. But education was just the beginning. Andrew expanded into digital platforms. He built affiliate systems where followers could earn money by promoting his content and products. It was a masterstroke. By helping others profit, he multiplied his own reach. Every participant became both a student and a soldier, spreading his brand while securing their own income. Then came investments. Andrew wasn't reckless with his success. He diversified into assets, real estate, digital businesses, ventures that provided long-term stability. Fighting had taught him the importance of defense. Business taught him the same. If one income stream collapsed, 10 others would sustain him. He also understood luxury as leverage. To outsiders, the supercars, the mansions, the private jets looked like vanity. But Andrew used them as tools. Every display of wealth reinforced the top G brand. Every Instagram post of a Lamborghini wasn't just flexing, it was marketing. Symbols of power attracted attention. Attention attracted followers. Followers became customers. The cycle fed itself. Andrew often compared income streams to weapons. One sword might break, but an arsenal makes you untouchable. By multiplying streams, he became resilient. While critics mocked him, while media attacked him, his empire kept generating revenue from every direction. And perhaps the most brilliant part of his strategy was decentralization. His businesses didn't depend on one platform, one company, or one algorithm. He had seen how quickly social media could ban or silence voices, so he built redundancies. Even if platforms tried to erase him, his businesses would survive. His content lived everywhere. His income came from everywhere. The results were undeniable. Within a short time, Andrew went from struggling to cover bills to managing an empire worth millions. But it wasn't just the money, it was the control. He had engineered a system where no single person or institution could cage him again. For Andrew, multiplying streams wasn't about greed, it was about sovereignty. A man with one income source is a slave. A man with 10 is free. He told himself, in the ring, I won by having more weapons than my opponent. In business, I win the same way. Multiple streams, endless leverage, untouchable. The empire was no longer a dream. It was reality, growing, expanding, and fortified against attack. Empires are not built by chance. They are engineered, and by this stage, Andrew Tate's empire had evolved into something bigger than businesses, bigger than social media, bigger than himself. It had become a machine. The beauty of this machine was in its design. Every part of Andrew's life reinforced every other part. His brand fueled his businesses. His businesses fueled his lifestyle. His lifestyle fueled his brand. It was a cycle of influence that grew stronger with every turn. Consider the flow. A clip of Andrew speaking went viral online. That clip drew millions of new viewers into his orbit. Some admired him, some despised him, but all paid attention. From there, a percentage followed his channels, joined his communities, or bought into his courses. That revenue funded the cars, the houses, the symbols of success. And those symbols, displayed online, created new content that sparked even more attention. The cycle was infinite, a self-sustaining engine. What set Andrew apart from other influencers was that he didn't just create content. He created a feedback loop. His influence drove his wealth. His wealth amplified his influence. Most influencers relied on outside validation, brand deals, sponsorships, corporations. Andrew relied only on his system. He didn't need approval. He owned his distribution. This machine made him anti-fragile. When critics attacked, his influence grew. When platforms tried to silence him, his supporters spread his message even further. Every attempt to destroy him only strengthened the cycle. The harder the world pushed, the more his machine expanded. It was the same principle he had learned in fighting. Pressure reveals weakness. But if you can endure pressure, you grow stronger. His empire wasn't fragile, it thrived under pressure. And at the heart of this machine was Andrew himself, not as a man, but as a symbol. Top G was larger than life. For supporters, he represented freedom, strength, and independence. For critics, he represented arrogance and danger. But either way, he was unforgettable. And in the attention economy, unforgettable equals unstoppable. Andrew knew the stakes. He knew that building such a machine meant painting a target on his back. The media would come. Governments would take notice. Platforms would strike. But he also knew something they didn't. You can ban a man, but you cannot ban a movement. His machine wasn't just him, it was the thousands who clipped his videos, the millions who repeated his words, the countless who saw him as proof that escape was possible. By the time the world realized how powerful his system had become, it was too late. The machine was already running. Autonomous, relentless, global. Andrew often described his philosophy in simple terms. A man with influence and wealth is untouchable, but a man who has built a machine that creates both, he is eternal. This was the foundation of his empire. Not just money, not just fame, but a system engineered to multiply itself, designed to outlast attacks, built to keep growing, regardless of what the world threw at him. The fighter had become the architect. The hustler had become the engineer. Andrew Tate was no longer playing the game, he was rewriting the rules. Every empire casts a shadow. For Andrew Tate, that shadow was controversy. As his influence grew, so did the noise around him. His clips flooded the internet, snippets of his speeches, his philosophy, his bold declarations. For supporters, these were messages of truth and empowerment. For critics, they were proof of arrogance, danger, even toxicity. The media saw an opportunity. Here was a figure impossible to ignore, charismatic, polarizing, unfiltered. Headlines began to appear. The most dangerous man on the internet, toxic influencer warping the minds of young men. Television debates dissected his words. Journalists hunted for angles. Every statement he made was twisted, reframed, weaponized. But Andrew expected this. In fact, he welcomed it. He had always said, if you are strong enough to stand for something, the world will try to tear you down. The louder they attack, the more powerful you become. And the attacks were loud. Articles painted him as a villain. Platforms flagged his content. Activists called for his removal. Each wave of criticism was meant to destroy him. But instead, it amplified him. People who had never heard of Andrew Tate before suddenly knew his name. Curious viewers searched his content to see for themselves. Many, upon hearing his full message, rather than a clipped soundbite, became supporters. The controversy fueled the cycle. The more the media demonized him, the more his influence grew. The shadow made the flame brighter. Andrew understood this dynamic perfectly. He knew the media didn't care about truth. They cared about narratives. And he was a perfect narrative ex-fighter turned entrepreneur turned digital overlord. They needed villains as much as they needed heroes. And he was willing to play the role. The firestorm reached new levels when schools, politicians, and organizations began naming him directly. Warning against his influence. Parents complained that their sons were quoting him. Teachers reported debates in classrooms sparked by his videos. The establishment panicked because they realized his words were in just trending online. They were shaping the next generation, and that terrified them. Andrew responded the only way he knew how, with more pressure, more clips, more boldness, more unapologetic declarations. To him, criticism was proof he was winning. If they ignore you, you don't matter, he often said. If they hate you, you've won. The shadow of controversy had arrived. But instead of running from it, Andrew stepped into it, because he knew that controversy is not the enemy of influence, it is the amplifier. For months, Andrew Tate had dominated the digital arena. His clips were everywhere. His name unavoidable, his influence undeniable. But power at that scale does not go unnoticed. The backlash was brewing. Governments, NGOs, media outlets, and platforms all faced mounting pressure to act. Activists demanded censorship. Journalists called him a threat. And soon, the digital hammer came down. One by one, the giants struck. Facebook ban, TikTok ban, YouTube ban. Virtually overnight, Andrew Tate was erased from the mainstream internet. Millions of followers gone. Accounts wiped clean. His empire, it seemed, had been decapitated. For most influencers, that would have been the end. Censorship kills those who rely on platforms for survival. But Andrew was not most influencers. He had been preparing for this moment all along. The truth was, by the time the bans arrived, Andrew had already decentralized his presence. His content lived on in thousands of clips, reposted by an army of supporters and affiliates. His words weren't confined to his accounts. They had multiplied, scattered across the digital landscape, impossible to erase. In fact, the bans made him bigger. News outlets reported on the censorship, ironically amplifying his name further. Debates raged. Was banning him proof of justice or proof of fear? People who had never heard of Andrew Tate before suddenly searched his name, curious about the man who could scare Silicon Valley into coordinated action. And what they found wasn't silence. It was more content. Thousands of accounts were still uploading his clips daily. The machine kept running. The bans had cut off the head, but the body lived on. Andrew responded not with despair, but with defiance. He compared the bans to being knocked down in a fight. Painful, yes, but not fatal. You can knock me down, he said, but you cannot knock me out. I will always rise. The censorship confirmed everything he had been saying, that the system fears men who speak truth, that society rewards obedience and punishes independence. For his followers, The bans were proof that Andrew Tate was dangerous to the establishment and, therefore, worth listening to even more. What was meant to silence him only legitimized him. Behind the scenes, Andrew adapted. He leaned into platforms that couldn't easily erase him. He directed his audience into private communities, mailing lists, and networks he controlled. If the mainstream wouldn't host him, he would build his own stage. This was the brilliance of his strategy. Censorship did not end his influence, it validated it. His critics thought they had won. In reality, they had poured gasoline on his fire. Andrew told himself, "In the ring, when my opponent hit hardest, that was my signal to fight harder." Online, censorship is the hardest punch and it only makes me stronger. The bans marked a turning point. He was no longer just an influence. He had become a symbol. A man censored for his words, yet amplified by the very system that tried to silence him. And symbols are much harder to kill than accounts. For most men, controversy is poison. Careers end, reputations shatter. Silence follows. But Andrew Tate was not most men. He took the very weapon designed to destroy him, controversy, and turned it into fuel. From the beginning, Andrew had understood that attention is indifferent. The algorithm doesn't care if people love you or hate you, it only cares if they engage. And nothing drives engagement like outrage. Every time the media attacked him, every time critics screamed his name, the cycle of influence spun faster. What they didn't realize was that they were feeding him. Articles calling him toxic made people curious. TV debates portraying him as dangerous made him magnetic. Bans meant to erase him validated his message. That the system fears men who refuse to conform. For millions of young men, this was proof. Proof that Andrew wasn't just speaking empty words, he was living them. He leaned into the storm. Instead of softening his tone, he sharpened it. Instead of apologizing, he doubled down. Where others would have begged for forgiveness, Andrew declared, "The harder you attack me, the stronger I become." And he was right. His communities swelled with new members. His businesses grew faster than ever. His name trended worldwide. Even those who hated him couldn't stop talking about him. The controversy had transformed him from an influencer into a cultural lightning rod. Andrew often compared it to fighting. Pain is inevitable in the ring. If you run from it, you lose. But if you learn to absorb it, to channel it, to weaponize it, you become unstoppable. Controversy was the same. It hurt, but it also gave him power. Every insult became motivation. Every attack became proof of his relevance. Every ban became free marketing. His enemies couldn't silence him because they were the ones spreading his message further. The brilliance of this strategy was that it turned weakness into strength. Most men crumble under pressure. Andrew thrived under it. He understood a simple truth. Controversy isn't the enemy of influence, it's the multiplier. The louder the hate, the more undeniable he became. Of course, the storm took its toll. Friends distanced themselves. The media vilified him relentlessly. Platforms erased his accounts. But Andrew didn't measure himself by comfort. He measured himself by impact. And the impact was undeniable. By embracing controversy instead of fleeing from it, Andrew Tate rewrote the rules of influence. He proved that in the modern age, the man who dares to be hated can achieve a level of fame, reach, and power that the safe and agreeable will never touch. Love him or hate him, Andrew Tate had become inevitable. And inevitability is the ultimate power. Behind every great empire stands loyalty. For Andrew Tate, that loyalty was not bought, not borrowed, it was blood. His brother, Tristan Tate, wasn't just family. He was his shadow in war, his ally in business, his equal in ambition. Together, they formed a brotherhood that became the backbone of their rise. The story began long before fame and fortune. As children, the Tate brothers endured the same hardships. They grew up with the same father, learning discipline through chess, absorbing lessons about strategy and survival. They struggled through the same poverty, the same uncertainty, the same fights that shaped their hunger. While other brothers drifted apart in pursuit of separate lives. Andrew and Tristan sharpened each other like steel against steel. When Andrew entered the world of kickboxing, Tristan was there. When Tristan pursued fighting, Andrew supported him. They trained together, bled together, celebrated victories together, and mourned defeats together. In the ring, they were warriors. Outside it, they were soldiers in the same army. But the brotherhood wasn't just about blood. It was about alignment. Many men fail in life because they are surrounded by people who don't share their vision. Friends betray. Partners flake. Allies drift. But Andrew and Tristan were inseparable. They shared the same values. Strength, loyalty, freedom. They shared the same enemy. Weakness, mediocrity, conformity. When Andrew began his entrepreneurial journey, Tristan was at his side. When Andrew stumbled through failures, Tristan endured the losses too. And when success finally came, they shared it not as two individuals, but as one unit. This unity became their greatest weapon. In a world where most men fight alone, Andrew and Tristan fought together. When one was attacked, the other defended. When one built, the other reinforced. Their empire was not one man's vision, it was a brotherhood's mission. Supporters admired this bond. They saw in the Tate brothers something rare. Loyalty that couldn't be broken by money, fame, or power. Critics tried to exploit it, painting them as reckless or dangerous together. But every attempt to divide them failed. Andrew often said, "I can face the world alone if I have to. But with my brother by my side, I cannot lose." The Tate brothers became a symbol not just of wealth and influence, but of unity. They proved that brotherhood, when rooted in loyalty and shared vision, could be a fortress against any storm. And as the world grew louder with controversy, bans, and attacks, that fortress became more important than ever. Because while empires rise and fall, brotherhood endures. Most powerful men fight their battles alone. They stand on the stage by themselves, shoulder the weight of the world, and face enemies with no backup. Andrew Tate was different. He had Tristan, and together they became something rare in the world of influence. A united front. This unity amplified everything they touched. When Andrew spoke, Tristan reinforced. When critics attacked, Tristan fired back. When Andrew built businesses, Tristan expanded them. They were not two separate forces. They were a synchronized strike. Supporters noticed the dynamic immediately. Andrew was sharp, loud, and confrontational. Tristan was measured, articulate, and equally ruthless. Where Andrew provoked, Tristan clarified. Where Andrew challenged, Tristan explained. The contrast didn't weaken them, strengthened them. Two different tones, one message, two different styles, one vision. In interviews, podcasts, and debates, their chemistry was undeniable. Andrew's fiery statements drew attention, and Tristan's calm delivery gave weight to the message. Together, they were unstoppably like two fighters cornering the same opponent from different angles. The brotherhood also gave them resilience. Controversy that might have broken one man was absorbed by two. If Andrew was targeted, Tristan carried the torch. If Tristan was attacked, Andrew defended him publicly. Their loyalty wasn't a performative. It was absolute. And in a world where betrayal is common, that loyalty became magnetic. This united front extended into their businesses. They didn't compete against each other. They collaborated. They diversified income streams, expanded their empire, and managed ventures as a team. Where most partnerships fracture under the pressure of money and fame, the Tates only grew stronger. Critics, of course, tried to exploit this bond. The media painted them as a dangerous duo, brothers who encouraged rebellion against the system. Some platforms attempted to separate their content, banning one while leaving the other online. But it never worked. The Tate brand was too interconnected, too synchronized. Silencing one brother only amplified the other. Their unity became part of their myth. Supporters saw in them a model of masculine loyalty, brothers who refused to betray each other no matter the reward, no matter the risk. Young men admired the strength of their bond, often wishing for the same kind of brotherhood in their own lives. Andrew often said, "The world can take my money, my accounts, even my freedom, but as long as I have my brother, I cannot be destroyed." It was not just rhetoric, it was strategy. A united front made them untouchable. In the eyes of their followers, Andrew and Tristan weren't just two men, they were one force. And that force grew stronger every time it was tested. For Andrew and Tristan Tate, brotherhood was more than blood. It was more than loyalty. It was strategy. In a world obsessed with individualism, the Tate brothers stood as a duo, two men bound by loyalty, vision, and mission. This wasn't just family, it was a brand. And that brand carried weight. The image was powerful. Not one successful man, but two. Not one fighter who escaped the system, but brothers who did it together. Supporters didn't just see wealth, cars, or luxury, they saw loyalty. They saw proof that family, when aligned, could become a fortress. Andrew and Tristan leaned into this image deliberately. They knew the power of optics. When they appeared together, they looked like generals of the same army. Their conversations flowed like rehearsed strategy, even though it was natural alignment. Where most influencers presented themselves as isolated personalities, the Tates presented themselves as a brotherhood. This branding had impact. Young men around the world didn't just aspire to Andrew's confidence or Tristan's composure. They aspired to the unity between them. In an age where betrayal is common and loyalty rare, their bond became aspirational. It wasn't just about becoming rich. It was about not walking the path alone. Their brotherhood also gave them an edge in business. Negotiations, interviews, and ventures were never a solo mission. Two voices, two perspectives, two strengths, yet one direction. This unity made them harder to manipulate, harder to defeat. Opponents could attack one, but the other always held the line. And strategically, it was genius. By sharing the spotlight, they became harder to erase. Even when platforms banned Andrew, Tristan remained visible. Even when the media attacked one, the other could counter. Their brand wasn't dependent on a single figure, was distributed across two, doubling their resilience. But beyond resilience, their brotherhood amplified their empire. They played off each other in content. Andrew's sharp, aggressive energy paired with Tristan's calm, measured delivery created balance. It was a 1-2 punch. Shock and explanation, fire and steel. The formula worked. Critics called it dangerous. Supporters called it inspiring. Either way, it was effective. Andrew once said, "One man can be ignored. Two men, aligned, cannot." And he was right. Their brotherhood made them bigger than individuals. It made them a movement. By this stage of their rise, the Tate brothers weren't just building businesses, they were building a mythology. The story of two brothers who faced poverty, fought through pain, endured controversy, and rose together as one force. A story that resonated deeper than wealth or luxury. It resonated with the primal human desire for loyalty and strength. And mythology is more powerful than marketing. Myths live longer than men. That was the genius of their brotherhood. It wasn't only blood, it wasn't only loyalty. It was the foundation of their empire. A symbol, a strategy, a brand. Andrew and Tristan had become inseparable in the eyes of the world. And as their influence spread, one truth became undeniable. Alone they were strong, but together they were unstoppable. The higher you rise, the stronger the resistance. For Andrew and Tristan Tate, the storm of controversy had already made them global figures. But soon, the battle moved beyond media headlines and social media bans. A new kind of pressure emerged, legal, political, and systemic. It began with whispers, articles hinting at investigations, authorities suggesting wrongdoing, headlines growing darker, more ominous. Critics who once mocked them now demanded punishment. The media machine that had once painted them as toxic influencers shifted gears, now portraying them as dangerous criminals. The timing wasn't coincidence. The Tate brothers had reached a level of influence that threatened established narratives. Millions of young men were questioning authority, schools, and mainstream culture because of their message. The system doesn't ignore men who inspire rebellion. It seeks to neutralize them. And so the siege began. Raids, investigations, accusations, legal proceedings blasted across headlines worldwide. Cameras swarmed their properties. Detractors celebrated, convinced that the empire was finally collapsing. Supporters rallied, arguing that the attacks were proof of everything Andrew had warned about. That powerful voices who refuse to bow will always be targeted. Inside the chaos, Andrew remained composed. He had been here before, in different forms. The ring had taught him that panic never wins fights. Pressure must be absorbed, analyzed, and countered. He told himself, if they come for me, it's because I matter. The dogs don't bark at nobodies. Tristan stood by his side, as always. The brotherhood that once built businesses now braced for war. Together, they framed the siege, not as a downfall, but as a test. A new arena, with higher stakes than ever before. For the brothers, the accusations and investigations weren't just personal, they were symbolic. If they could survive this, their message would only grow stronger. If they crumbled, the system would celebrate victory. But Andrew and Tristan refused to break. Instead, they leaned into the storm. They spoke defiantly about corruption, censorship, and manipulation. They positioned themselves as warriors, standing against a rigged system. For supporters, this was electrifying. It confirmed that the brothers weren't just entrepreneurs, they were rebels against the establishment. The siege painted them as villains in mainstream media. But in the eyes of millions, it made them martyrs. And martyrdom, in the age of influence, multiplies power. The gates had been stormed. The empire was under attack. But the Tate brothers had no intention of surrendering. Because for them, the siege wasn't the end. It was the next battle. A siege is not won in a day. It grinds, it suffocates, it tests endurance. For Andrew and Tristan Tate, the media firestorm was only the beginning. Soon came the real pressure. Legal battles, investigations, and imprisonment. The world watched as headlines exploded. Tate brothers detained. Cameras showed them led away in handcuffs, swarmed by flashing lights and shouting journalists. For critics, this was victory. For supporters, it was theatre. And for Andrew, it was familiar. He had been here before, though in different form. In the ring, he had felt the crushing weight of an opponent's punches, the pain of being knocked down, Now, the blows came from judges, lawyers, and systems of power. But the principle was the same. Absorb the hit, endure the pain, and wait for the counterstrike. Prison became his new arena. Stripped of freedom, cut off from his empire, Andrew faced conditions designed to break him. Cold cells, endless waiting, isolation. For most men, it would have been enough to crush the spirit. But Andrew refused to fold. Instead, he reframed the trial. To him, prison wasn't punishment, it was sharpening. Each day was another test of discipline. Each hour another chance to prove that his mind was stronger than walls, stronger than bars, stronger than the system itself. He wrote, he meditated, he trained his body within the confines of the cell. And, most importantly, he thought, strategy doesn't die in captivity, it matures. Tristan shared the same resolve. Side by side, even behind bars, the brotherhood endured. Supporters around the world rallied, spreading their message louder than ever. Online, the Tate brothers became a symbol of defiancemen, willing to suffer rather than bow. Meanwhile, the media framed them as villains. Every detail was twisted. Every rumor became headline. But controversy, as always, worked in their favor. The more the press attacked, the more their names echoed globally. What was meant to erase them instead immortalized them. Andrew often said, "A man cannot be destroyed from the outside if he refuses to be destroyed from within." Prison became proof of that philosophy. The trials dragged on long days of uncertainty, accusations, and pressure. But Andrew knew something most didn't. Trials are not only fought in courtrooms, they are fought in the court of public opinion. And in that arena, he was still winning. Clips of him speaking about resilience circulated online. Quotes from his writings behind bars spread like wildfire. Far from silencing him, imprisonment had amplified him. His suffering had turned into his strongest message yet. That no cage can hold a free mind. For Andrew, these trials of fire were not setbacks. They were part of the story. They didn't just endure it, they transformed it into strength. Locked in cold cells, watching the world debate their names, they realized something profound. Pressure is inevitable, but how you respond to it defines you. The system had thrown everything at them: media, slander, censorship, raids, prison, and still they stood, bruised but unbroken. Isolated but not defeated. Andrew called it the siege mentality, a way of thinking forged under constant attack. It meant expecting resistance, preparing for betrayal, and thriving under pressure. To him, life was war, and war demanded warriors who could endure endless sieges. This mentality became his shield. When critics said his empire was crumbling, he reminded himself that walls under siege become stronger if defended. Every day in confinement was another chance to sharpen their minds and prepare for the battles ahead. And outside, their message only grew louder. Supporters rallied, interpreting their imprisonment as proof that the system feared them. Online, Free the Tates became a rallying cry. Their absence did not weaken their presence, it magnified it. The siege mentality spread. What their enemies intended as humiliation became elevation. The siege had backfired. The brothers emerged from their trials not as diminished men, but as living symbols. To supporters, they were proof that strength, loyalty, and discipline can withstand even the mightiest assaults. To critics, they remained villains. But in the attention economy, villains often outlive heroes. The siege mentality became the core of their philosophy moving forward. It wasn't about comfort, it wasn't about peace, it was about readiness, always prepared for the next attack, always expecting resistance, always unshakable. Because Andrew knew the truth. Empires are not destroyed from the outside, they collapse from within. As long as his mind, his brotherhood, and his will remained intact, no force could truly conquer him. And so the Tate brothers carried their siege mentality into the next stage of their empire. Not broken, but fortified. By the time the storms had passed, Andrew Tate stood in a place few men ever reach. He had conquered the ring, built businesses, created a global brand, endured controversy, survived censorship, and withstood the siege of legal and political battles. Wealth, cars, luxury, he had them all. Fame, notoriety, influence, those too. But Andrew knew that legacy is not built on possessions. Possessions fade, cars break, mansions crumble. Fame itself is fleeting. Legacy is something else entirely. It is the mark you leave on the world long after the headlines vanish. For Andrew, that mark was not the cars in his garage or the watches on his wrist. It was the millions of young men whose lives he had touched. The boys who once felt weak, who once felt invisible, now, quoting his words, the generation raised on lies of comfort and conformity, now embracing strength, discipline, and ambition because of his message. This realization shifted his perspective. The goal was never just wealth. Wealth was the tool. Influence was the weapon. The true mission was transformation, shaping men into warriors, into thinkers, into individuals who refused to bow to a broken system. Andrew saw himself less as a businessman and more as an archetype. He was the fighter who refused defeat, the hustler who refused mediocrity, the rebel who refused silence. Love him or hate him, his story became impossible to erase. And that was the point. Every empire eventually faces decline. Every leader eventually dies. But ideas, when strong enough, live forever. Andrew wanted his legacy to be an idea, the idea that men must reclaim their power, that freedom is worth fighting for, that discipline is the key to everything. He told himself, they can ban me, they can cage me, they can slander me, but they cannot erase me. Because I don't just exist in myself, exist in every man I've inspired. This was the legacy of the top G. Not the empire he built, but the fire he lit in others. Beyond wealth, beyond fame, beyond himself, every legend faces the same paradox. The man lives in flesh, but the myth lives forever. For Andrew Tate, this paradox became his reality. The man was human, born into hardship, trained in the ring, scarred by failures, hardened by trials. He felt pain, fear, and doubt like anyone else. He endured broken bones, sleepless nights, betrayal, and pressure. He made mistakes, he bled, he suffered. That was Andrew Tate, the man at top G. That was something different. That was the myth, the larger-than-life symbol, the character too bold to ignore, the figure that embodied wealth, strength, and defiance. Top G was untouchable, unbreakable, eternal. He wasn't confined by cells, bans, or borders. He existed in stories, in clips, in the minds of millions. At times, even Andrew admitted that the line between man and myth blurred. Was he living his life, or performing it? Was the persona a mask, or was it simply the truest version of himself, amplified for the world to see? Perhaps it didn't matter. What mattered was impact. The myth served the mission. The man carried the weight. And yet, Andrew never denied his humanity. He spoke openly of his struggles, his doubts, his moments of weakness. But instead of hiding them, he reframed them. Weakness became proof of authenticity. Struggle became evidence of resilience. Pain became fuel for the story. By admitting he was human, he made the myth even stronger. Followers saw themselves in the man. They aspired to become the myth. That bridge between human and legend was what made his influence so powerful. Critics tried to attack him by pointing out flaws, contradictions, and imperfections. But Andrew understood something they didn't. Myths don't require perfection. They require endurance. Heroes of history were never flawless. They were remembered because they fought, because they endured, because they refused to be erased. And so, the myth of Top G grew larger than Andrew Tate himself. Even if he vanished tomorrow, the character would remain. His quotes would still circulate, his clips would still echo. His story would still inspire and provoke. This was intentional. Andrew had always said, "You must become more than a man. You must become an idea. Ideas don't die. Ideas multiply." The man lived the pain. The myth carried the message. Together, they created a legacy impossible to silence. Because, in the end, Andrew Tate, the man, will be remembered. But Top G, the myth, will live forever. Mortality is the fate of every man. Wealth can be lost. Cars rust, mansions crumble. Even the strongest body weakens with time. But Andrew Tate understood something most men never grasp. Influence can outlive flesh. To him, true immortality was not about living forever. It was about being remembered forever. It was about building an idea so powerful that it continues to shape minds long after the man is gone. Andrew had seen this truth in history. Great warriors, philosophers, and leaders all faced death. But their words, their teachings, their stories lived on. The Spartans at Thermopylae, the emperors of Rome, the thinkers of ancient philosophy were mortal. Yet their influence echoes through centuries. That was the path Andrew chose for himself. Top G was never just a persona, it was an idea. The idea that men should be strong, disciplined, and free. The idea that you must fight for sovereignty in a world designed to weaken you. The idea that pain is not punishment, but fuel. And ideas cannot be banned. They cannot be censored. They cannot be imprisoned. Even as platforms erased his accounts, even as critics smeared his name, Andrew's message lived on through millions who repeated his words. Supporters carried the torch, spreading the philosophy, teaching others. In that moment, Andrew realized that he had already achieved a form of immortality. He often said, "The greatest power is to exist inside the minds of others." And he did. Every young man who hit the gym because of his words, every entrepreneur who started a hustle because of his story, every individual who broke free of conformity carried a piece of his legacy. Immortality through influence. Andrew never claimed he would live forever, but he made sure his message would. He didn't just build businesses, he built a movement. He didn't just entertain, he inspired. He didn't just speak, he engraved his philosophy into the culture of a generation. And so, the legacy of Top G was sealed. Not in the wealth amassed, not in the controversies endured, but in the countless men who rose from weakness to strength, from despair to ambition, because one man dared to speak unapologetically. Andrew Tate, the man, will one day fade. But Top G, the idea, will not, because immortality is not flesh. Immortality is influence.